Today on the show, we're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing. Things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you, with the help of some experts, to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. Tiberius Caesar Augustus, once celebrated as a disciplined general and capable administrator, ascended the Roman throne in 14 AD under the shadow of a monumental legacy. Rome, weary from the long and transformative reign of Augustus, welcomed his adopted son with cautious optimism. A man of proven military skill, Tiberius had secured Rome's northern borders and demonstrated administrative competence. At first, he appeared the embodiment of stability, frugal with public funds, diligent in governance, and outwardly respectful of the Senate. Yet beneath this composed exterior, a private storm brewed. The early tragedies of Tiberius's life, his brother Drusus's untimely death, a politically forced divorce from his first wife Vipania, and the loveless marriage to Julia, Augustus's notoriously promiscuous daughter, had etched deep fissures into his soul. The grief and humiliation he endured quietly festered, transforming subtle bitterness into a simmering resentment that would later fuel acts of cruelty beyond comprehension. By the end of the first decade of his reign, Tiberius's competence in governance masked a deepening psychological decay. The emperor's retreat to Capri marked the beginning of a period historians would later describe as morally nightmarish. Perched on jagged cliffs overlooking the azure waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea, Tiberius's villas were architectural marvels: marble, pillars soaring skyward, gardens fragrant with exotic flowers, terraced courtyards with labyrinthine passages, but their beauty belied the darkness within. Inside these palatial walls, Tiberius surrounded himself with objects and symbols of human indulgence. Erotic artworks and imported literature were displayed openly, serving as both amusement and instruction, and his private chambers became stages for performances that terrified all who participated. Tiberius developed a system of surveillance and terror. Visitors to Capri often returned haunted, or not at all. Courtiers, senators, and youths were observed constantly. Any hesitation, fear, or moral resistance could be construed as disloyalty. The emperor orchestrated what he referred to as chains, situations in which individuals were forced to participate in acts of intimacy under his watchful eye, while his attendants ensured obedience. Procurers scoured the empire to supply fresh participants, and professional informers, known as delatores, thrived in this environment of fear. Property was confiscated, families torn apart, and reputations destroyed for the slightest hint of dissent. Tiberius's cruelty extended beyond political manipulation into deeply personal horrors. Children of noble families were punished for showing excessive grief. Mothers were coerced to offer their daughters to the imperial court, and the very law itself became a weapon. Ancient statutes were revived and twisted to justify acts that blurred the line between governance and sadism. Senators, fearing the reach of imperial vengeance, often ended their own lives to protect their families. Those who survived lived in constant tension, wary of the gaze of an emperor who found satisfaction not only in obedience, but in witnessing the suffering of others. Even as Tiberius aged, his physical desires diminished, but his obsession with control intensified. His skin, once unremarkable, was ravaged by sores and pustules, and he hid his baldness beneath wigs, masking decay with makeup. Paranoia consumed him. Astrologers were consulted daily, and those who predicted misfortune or death were executed. Tiberius occasionally left Capri for brief but terrifying journeys to the mainland, leaving a trail of fear and devastation. Each visit reminded the empire that no one was safe, that power had become inseparable from cruelty. The moral and social fabric of Rome suffered irrevocably under Tiberius's rule. Fear permeated daily life. Education shifted from rhetoric and civic preparation to survival skills, how to navigate the volatile court, how to appease the emperor without appearing subservient, and how to read the subtle signs of disfavor. Religious observance continued, but faith was shaken. Natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and fires, were interpreted as divine wrath, perhaps angered by the emperor's depravity. Mystery cults and Stoic philosophy offered solace to citizens desperate to understand a world in which virtue seemed powerless and vice triumphant. Tiberius's court became a self-perpetuating ecosystem of corruption. Informers gained wealth and influence, courtiers advanced through moral compromise, and procurers became indispensable, their power deriving from the emperor's appetite for control. Even the villas themselves, magnificent constructions of Roman engineering, became instruments of human manipulation. The juxtaposition of stunning architecture and unthinkable cruelty created a paradox. Beauty and horror coexisted in perfect tension, amplifying the psychological weight of Tiberius's dominion. By the end of his life, Tiberius had permanently altered Roman society. The Senate was broken, trust eroded, and families lived under the constant specter of imperial oversight. The emperor's influence reached beyond physical acts of cruelty. He had normalized fear as a guiding principle, redefining loyalty, morality, and law. His death, in 37 AD, did not immediately restore order or dignity, while his successor Caligula ensured he received the ceremonial rights of an emperor. The emotional and psychological scars on Rome endured for generations. Tiberius remains a historical paradox, a man capable of brilliant strategy and governance, yet consumed by depravity. His reign serves as a stark warning of how absolute power, unbound by law or moral constraint, can corrupt entirely, transforming a disciplined general into a figure whose appetites and cruelty shaped the trajectory of an empire. Civilization, Tiberius's story reminds us, is fragile. Fear, complicity, and moral compromise can rapidly erode even the most stable of societies. After years of secluded life on Capri, Tiberius's reputation had transformed into a legend of terror. From the cliffs overlooking the sea, the emperor ruled with a combination of meticulous planning and unpredictable cruelty, enforcing an unrelenting hierarchy of fear. Rumors of the horrors within the villas spread through Rome like wildfire. Couriers returning from the island spoke in hushed tones about the strange rituals, the chains of obedience, and the unyielding scrutiny imposed by the emperor. Even those who had never visited Capri felt the oppressive weight of Tiberius's gaze. In the early days, Tiberius had maintained a facade of discipline and order, attending to governance through letters and deputies, but his interactions became increasingly sinister. Senators and officials feared that any hesitation in communication could be interpreted as defiance. Private conversations were dangerous. Even the subtlest expression of doubt or anxiety might seal a man's fate. He relied on professional informers, delatores, who monitored every gesture, every whisper, every shadowed glance. The informers became both indispensable and despised, wielding power through terror. Tiberius's isolation nurtured his obsession with the boundaries of loyalty and submission. Within the sprawling villas, the emperor orchestrated situations that tested obedience in ways both psychological and morally devastating. Guests were forced into participation, often under the watch of attendants whose presence signaled that observation was constant. While contemporary sources emphasize the emperor's perverse fascination with human behavior, the historical accounts also suggest a meticulous system. No act was random, no cruelty without structure. He had transformed his private indulgences into instruments of control, reinforcing the idea that survival depended upon complete submission. The natural beauty of Capri, azure waters, fragrant gardens, soaring cliffs, stood in stark contrast to the human suffering within. Marble corridors echoed with silent tension, while sunlight spilling through arched windows illuminated the meticulous arrangements of villas designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. Tiberius moved among these spaces like a predator, observing, assessing, and manipulating. His attendants, loyal yet fearful, facilitated the emperor's will, ensuring that every participant in the games understood both the reward of obedience and the cost of resistance. News of the emperor's cruelty reached the broader Roman world, affecting not only political life but family structures and alliances. Mothers trembled at the thought of losing their children, wives carefully moderated their behavior, and even distant provincial governors hesitated before sending envoys or tribute. The fear of imperial vengeance created a self-perpetuating culture of compliance and anxiety. Historians note that Tiberius's reign represents one of the most chilling examples of how centralized power, unrestrained by law or morality, can infiltrate every level of society. On Capri, the emperor's obsession with detail extended to appearances. Though advancing in age, he remained fixated on image, employing wigs and cosmetic treatments to mask the ravages of disease and age. Visitors to the villas observed not only the physical decay of their ruler, but the psychological toll it had taken. The emperor's eyes, sharp and calculating, revealed both paranoia and the dark satisfaction he derived from observing human vulnerability. Shadows cast by flickering torches accentuated the tension, highlighting the stark contrast between beauty and corruption. Even ceremonial events became tools of power and terror. Public functions were staged with careful manipulation of emotion. Grief had to be moderated, joy measured, loyalty displayed at every opportunity. Failure to conform to the invisible rules carried deadly consequences. Children were punished for emotional excess. Parents were coerced into compliance through threats to their families. The emperor's ability to intertwine political authority with psychological and moral dominance made him uniquely terrifying in Roman history. Tiberius also exploited knowledge and superstition. Astrologers and seers were consulted regularly, feeding his paranoia with predictions of betrayal or death. Those who delivered unfavorable prophecies often met with swift, quiet punishment, reinforcing the omnipotence of the emperor's control. Even natural death offered no reprieve from imperial vengeance. Estates were confiscated, memorials destroyed, and families left in destitution. Fear thus became both the instrument and the product of his reign, shaping the empire's social, political, and moral landscape. The long-term effects of this climate were profound. Rome's once vibrant culture of debate and civic engagement eroded into a society of careful observation and calculated speech. Education shifted focus. Young nobles were taught to navigate courtly danger rather than rhetoric, to flatter subtly and survive politically rather than aspire to ideals of justice or service. Stoic philosophy gained popularity, emphasizing inner virtue and control over external circumstances, providing mental refuge to those navigating the treacherous corridors of imperial power. Amid these horrors, Tiberius remained vigilant, constantly refining his dominion over body and mind. Even in the twilight of life, his meticulous control over every aspect of courtly and domestic behavior revealed an acute awareness of vulnerability and power. He had transformed fear into a form of governance, ensuring that submission and obedience were not only expected, but internalized. The psychological landscape of Rome itself shifted. Loyalty became performative, morality flexible, and survival dependent upon keen perception and absolute discretion. As Tiberius aged, the once orderly mechanisms of Roman governance began to warp under the weight of fear. From Capri, he maintained control over the Senate and provinces with meticulous precision, yet the methods had become increasingly insidious. Every letter, every edict, every decision was a tool to reinforce obedience, extend influence, and remind the empire that power came with a cost. The emperor's isolation fostered an acute awareness of human behavior. Guests and officials alike navigated a landscape defined by invisible rules. A glance that lingered too long, a hesitant gesture, a poorly timed smile could provoke suspicion. Even seasoned senators, once masters of rhetoric and protocol, found themselves second-guessing every word. Tiberius had turned simple interactions into high-stakes exercises in judgment, where failure could mean loss of wealth, status, or life. Within the villas, the emperor's obsessions with control extended to daily routines. Attendants monitored behavior with unwavering diligence, ensuring that every action aligned with Tiberius's expectations. Private spaces were both arenas and instruments of governance. Guests were watched, subtle tests conducted, and the consequences of disobedience enforced with ruthless precision. Visitors often described the air of silent tension, the constant sense of being observed, and the impossible task of predicting the emperor's whims. The physical environment reflected the duality of the emperor's rule. The villas on Capri were architectural marvels, their terraces overlooking the Mediterranean, their gardens vibrant with blooms, fountains sparkling in the sunlight. Yet within these paradises, psychological pressure reigned supreme. Rooms designed for leisure were also stages for obedience, and the beauty of the surroundings contrasted sharply with the emotional weight of human fear. This juxtaposition was a deliberate reinforcement of Tiberius's authority. Paradise and peril existed side by side. Tiberius's paranoia extended to all aspects of life. Astrologers were consulted with unwavering seriousness, their predictions shaping decisions and reinforcing a climate of uncertainty. Those whose counsel displeased the emperor risked swift retribution. Even natural events, storms, earthquakes, or disease, were interpreted through the lens of imperial suspicion, reminders that no power, mortal or divine, could be ignored. The broader Roman world felt the reverberations of Tiberius's rule. Provincial governors acted cautiously, wary of sending envoys or tributes that might be perceived as insufficiently deferential. Noble families practiced meticulous self-censorship, instructing children on the subtle art of survival. The very concept of virtue became intertwined with performance. Loyalty was demonstrated through compliance, morality through the careful calibration of actions to avoid offense. Political purges continued to shape society. Officials who failed to navigate the labyrinth of expectations faced removal, their estates confiscated, and their families marginalized. The mechanisms of law, once designed to protect and provide justice, became instruments of coercion. Ancient statutes were resurrected, reinterpreted, and weaponized, allowing Tiberius to impose authority with surgical precision. Survival depended upon keen observation, discretion, and the ability to anticipate the emperor's moods. Despite the oppressive environment, some figures managed to navigate the system successfully. Their skill lay not only in obedience, but in understanding human behavior. Courtiers and informers who thrived under Tiberius were often intelligent, morally flexible, and adept at reading the unspoken rules. They became secondary agents of power, extending the emperor's reach and perpetuating the culture of fear. Their presence ensured that Tiberius's influence remained pervasive, even when he himself retreated into seclusion. Amid these dynamics, Tiberius's physical decline did little to diminish his psychological dominance. Wigs and makeup masked the ravages of age and disease, while his presence continued to evoke a mix of awe and dread. The emperor moved with deliberate calculation, observing, testing, and manipulating. The villas of Capri, in their architectural beauty, became instruments for psychological control, demonstrating how environment, appearance, and expectation could shape behavior as powerfully as law or edict. The contrast between Tiberius's earlier military brilliance and his later reign highlights the transformative nature of absolute authority. Once celebrated for securing Rome's borders and demonstrating disciplined leadership, he now symbolized the subtle, pervasive power of fear. The empire, outwardly stable, carried the hidden burdens of psychological strain, moral compromise, and social adaptation to survival under an omnipresent authority. Rome continued to pulse with life, yet beneath the grandeur of marble forums and bustling marketplaces, an invisible tension gripped the city. Though Tiberius remained on Capri, his reach had become omnipresent, threading through the empire via letters, messengers, and the subtle orchestration of loyal intermediaries. Senators and magistrates found themselves navigating a labyrinth of fear. A word misinterpreted, a gesture misunderstood, could end in disgrace, confiscation, or exile. The city's vibrant rhythm masked an undercurrent of anxiety, a constant low hum of unspoken dread. Families of the elite trained their children in discretion, instructing them to suppress impulses and conceal emotions beneath layers of politeness. Conversations were measured, smiles were calculated, and every action was filtered through the lens of survival. Wealthy citizens learned to balance ambition with caution, understanding that overt excellence might attract suspicion as easily as mediocrity could offer invisibility. Even casual interactions in the marketplace carried a weight, as informers and whisperers could transform the smallest act into evidence for imperial scrutiny. The mechanisms of control extended to the provinces. Legions stationed at the empire's borders maintained order primarily through routine and discipline, their commanders transmitting reports back to Capri. Provincial officials operated within a system of incentives and fear, ensuring that Tiberius's edicts were followed without direct supervision. The empire functioned outwardly as a machine of efficiency and stability, but beneath the surface, fear and moral compromise were the currencies of daily life. Within Rome, magistrates and courtiers adapted to the indirect yet pervasive authority of the emperor. Some became exceptionally skilled at reading subtle cues, the tension in a colleague's posture, the unspoken implications of a phrase, or the strategic use of silence. These individuals flourished, rewarded for their capacity to interpret and manipulate the environment in alignment with Tiberius's expectations. Yet any misstep could destroy not only careers, but entire family lines. Confiscations of estates, annulments of marriages, and forced displacements became common tools to ensure compliance. The cultural life of Rome reflected this duality of outward prosperity and inward apprehension. Art, literature, and architecture celebrated achievements of the empire, but also subtly reinforced the omnipresent power of the emperor. Temples and public spaces carried messages of loyalty and vigilance. Civic celebrations were underlined with an awareness that even joyous occasions could draw attention and scrutiny. Religious leaders interpreted signs and omens carefully, wary that their readings could either curry favor or provoke wrath. Natural disasters, storms, floods, fires, were perceived as divine commentary on human behavior, magnifying the psychological impact of imperial authority. Despite the pervasive fear, human resilience found ways to persist. Families preserved wealth through subtle alliances and cautious negotiations. Courtiers developed networks of mutual protection, combining intelligence with prudence. Yet the price of survival remained steep, as the moral compromises demanded by the system continued to weigh on the collective conscience of Rome. The tension between public order and private terror shaped a society that functioned with discipline and ingenuity, but remained deeply traumatized beneath the surface. By the end of this period, Rome had transformed into a city where vigilance and prudence dictated every action. The emperor's physical absence did not reduce his influence. Instead, it amplified it through fear and anticipation. While outwardly stable, the empire's psychological and moral fabric had shifted, creating a legacy of survival tactics, subtle manipulation, and suppressed emotion that would echo through generations. The island of Capri, with its jagged cliffs and crystalline waters, had become more than a retreat for Tiberius. It was a fortress of power, isolation, and subtle terror. From his villas, perched high above the Mediterranean, he observed not only the distant horizon, but also the flow of human behavior that reached across the empire. His retreat had been framed as a choice of serenity, but in truth, it had evolved into an intricate system of influence, where distance magnified control. Messengers traveled daily between Capri and Rome, bearing letters that could elevate a man to favor or consign him to ruin. Tiberius's word, precise and often cryptic, carried weight that extended far beyond his physical presence. Senators feared the sudden withdrawal of imperial grace. Magistrates understood that compliance was survival, while any misstep, no matter how minor, could trigger scrutiny, accusation, or even exile. The island had become the fulcrum of empire-wide power, a remote command center where every detail of Rome's political and social life was observed and manipulated. Within the villas themselves, the atmosphere was a mixture of opulence and paranoia. Courtiers and attendants moved with careful precision, aware that any lapse could invite censure or more subtle forms of punishment. The architecture, though breathtaking in its design, reinforced control. Narrow corridors encouraged observation. High windows permitted surveillance, and gardens and terraces offered both beauty and exposure. Tiberius understood that the environment itself could shape behavior, and he meticulously curated every element to maintain influence and command. Visitors to Capri were both honored and terrorized. The island's seclusion meant that any act, speech, or hesitation could be interpreted in multiple ways, Diplomats, noblemen, and military officials quickly learned that success on the island required a combination of tact, awareness, and intuition. Many left with a sense of accomplishment, having navigated Tiberius's exacting standards, while others returned to Rome broken or diminished, their reputations subtly tarnished or completely undone. Beyond the villas, Capri's cliffs and hidden grottos became settings for the enactment of imperial authority in more personal ways. The emperor's gaze, the precise orchestration of social interaction, and the subtle orchestration of reward and fear created a microcosm of control. The lines between personal whim and political mandate blurred, and the human cost of survival was measured in compliance, manipulation, and calculated gestures. Every encounter, whether formal or informal, contributed to the web of power that Tiberius wove across the empire. Meanwhile, Rome continued to function as a city of contradictions. Public rituals, festivals, and legal proceedings proceeded with impressive order, but the psychological pressure of Tiberius's reach lingered. Families cultivated networks of influence, courtiers honed skills of observation and flattery, and magistrates carefully managed correspondence and reports. Beneath the surface of civic life, a subtle terror permeated decisions, relationships, and ambitions. The emperor's presence, though distant, created an invisible architecture of fear and adaptation, shaping generations of leadership and survival. Amidst this environment, Tiberius himself remained a figure of fascination and dread. His age and appearance had transformed him into a shadowy presence. His health, hair, and skin reflected years of meticulous attention and hidden infirmity. Yet his mind remained keen, calculating, and obsessive in control. The villas, gardens, and terraces were extensions of his will, and every servant, visitor, and official understood that the emperor's power was omnipresent, even when unseen. Capri had become both sanctuary and instrument, a stage on which the intricate theater of imperial influence was enacted daily. By the end of this period, the psychological impact of Capri's isolation had created a duality. The island itself represented both beauty and authority, leisure and vigilance, safety and threat. The emperor's reach extended not through armies alone, but through observation, calculated interventions, and the careful structuring of human behavior. The mechanisms of control he had developed, though subtle, ensured that the empire functioned in outward stability while inwardly reshaping minds, relationships, and social norms. The island's grip was absolute, and the lessons learned on its cliffs and terraces resonated far beyond the Mediterranean shore. While Capri remained the throne of observation, Rome simmered under a tension that was both visible and invisible. Senators and magistrates navigated daily routines with a constant awareness that the emperor's will could strike from afar. Tiberius's letters, brief and meticulously worded, had become instruments of both reward and subtle terror. A single line, ambiguous yet weighted, could secure a career or unravel it entirely. The political machinery of the city, once guided by principle and debate, now functioned under the shadow of distant authority. Families adapted, cultivating networks of loyalty and caution. Marriages, alliances, and friendships were carefully negotiated, as every interaction carried potential consequences. Informers, both official and opportunistic, scoured gatherings for phrases, gestures, and even glances that could be construed as disloyal. Tiberius's reach extended through the subtle orchestration of human perception. The knowledge that every action might be monitored created a pervasive psychological tension. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the distance of the emperor's island retreat did not equate to leniency. In the forum, magistrates delivered proclamations with careful neutrality, their speeches measured to avoid interpretation as critique. Tribunes moved among the crowds with constrained gestures, aware that subtle disapproval could be reported to Capri. Public ceremonies proceeded, but beneath the surface of civic display, the subtle terror of imperial oversight shaped behavior. The city's vibrancy, once a reflection of Roman confidence and debate, became subdued and orchestrated, each citizen performing their role in a carefully constructed theater of compliance. Meanwhile, Tiberius's attention to detail on Capri intensified. He scrutinized reports of local unrest, border skirmishes, and financial audits. Couriers traveled the Mediterranean with urgent dispatches, each arrival greeted with precise questioning. The emperor's understanding of distance management allowed him to maintain authority over events he never witnessed directly. Villas, gardens, and terraces became stages where courtiers performed both loyalty and skill, aware that even minor lapses could ripple across the empire. Amid this, Rome's judicial system evolved into a mechanism of control. Trials, once forums for debate and justice, now served as instruments of subtle warning. Accusations, often framed as civic concern, carried the unspoken weight of imperial scrutiny. Advocates found themselves balancing duty and caution, navigating an environment where legal precedent existed, but only as long as it aligned with the distant expectations emanating from Capri. The law became a tool not merely for order, but for shaping the psychology of those it governed. Even daily life in Rome felt the effects of Capri's shadow. Marketplaces, forums, and public baths bore the weight of unspoken observation. Citizens adjusted gestures, lowered voices, and cultivated expressions of deference. Families strategized communication, teaching children early how to navigate the invisible lines of power. Schools emphasized prudence, rhetoric, and observation, blending civic education with survival skills. Knowledge became inseparable from caution, and wisdom was measured not only by understanding, but by discretion. As Tiberius aged, his physical presence on Capri became more ceremonial than functional, yet his influence remained pervasive. Gardens were meticulously tended, villas repaired with care, and couriers trained in precision and timing. The emperor's personal health routines, discreet and obsessive, were mirrored by attendants who ensured every element of daily life reinforced control. Capri was more than a home. It was a lens through which the emperor viewed Rome, distorting and magnifying actions to maintain order, authority, and the subtle terror that had become central to governance. By the end of this period, the duality of Tiberius's empire had become starkly apparent. Public order, civic rituals, and imperial administration continued smoothly, yet beneath the surface, every social, political, and familial interaction was shaped by distant oversight. Rome's citizens and officials learned, often painfully, that survival required not only competence but psychological acuity. The lessons of Capri had spread across the empire. Power, even when removed, could permeate minds and communities, shaping behavior with an invisible hand. As Tiberius entered the final years of his reign, Rome's intricate web of politics and fear had become almost self-sustaining. The emperor rarely left Capri, yet his influence penetrated every corner of the empire. Reports from provincial governors arrived daily, each word carefully chosen to avoid offending the emperor. Any hint of discontent, whether in wording or tone, could result in sudden recall, confiscation, or even imprisonment. The people of Rome had internalized the lessons of years under a ruler who ruled with subtle terror. Vigilance, discretion, and pretense had replaced open debate and civic courage. Despite the physical distance, Tiberius's presence was intensely felt. He maintained a meticulous calendar of correspondence and consultations, with astrologers and trusted advisors providing guidance on the empire's trajectory. Capri's villas, with their lush gardens and meticulously constructed terraces, served as both home and control center. From these elevated vantage points, Tiberius surveyed couriers arriving from across the empire, scrutinizing reports on everything from tax collection to local disputes. Every detail mattered. Oversight was total. In Rome, senators performed their duties with visible restraint. Public oratory was carefully measured, and gestures once considered natural became loaded with significance. Social gatherings, once venues of lively discussion, had transformed into exercises in subtle signaling. Even the most routine interactions were fraught with potential peril. Families negotiated marriages not for love, but for strategic alliances that might protect them from imperial wrath. Friends were chosen with extreme care, their loyalty constantly assessed. The legal system had transformed into a theater of warning. Trials, ostensibly for civic misdeeds, were in reality lessons in obedience. Judges competed to interpret laws in ways that demonstrated their prudence and loyalty, while advocates carefully calibrated their defenses to avoid crossing invisible boundaries. The system rewarded subtlety and punished presumption. Over time, the Roman sense of justice had evolved into a performance. Appearances mattered more than principles. Even Rome's military felt the emperor's distant influence. While legions on the frontiers maintained discipline and readiness, promotions and transfers were now heavily mediated through channels that reflected political favor. Generals and centurions learned to navigate the subtleties of imperial oversight, balancing operational demands with the necessity of appeasing distant authority. A misstep could stall a career or invite investigation, reminding commanders that Capri's shadow extended even to the edges of the empire. Tiberius himself had grown increasingly reclusive, yet paradoxically more engaged in the minutiae of empire management. He consulted daily with astrologers, obsessively tracking omens and predicting potential threats. Courtiers and advisors who delivered reports were often kept waiting, tested for their patience and composure. Each delay, each scrutinized line, reinforced the atmosphere of psychological tension that had become the hallmark of his reign. Capri's gardens and villas, serene in appearance, masked an environment of intense control and meticulous observation. As tensions mounted, cracks began to show in the social fabric. Families lived in constant anxiety, anticipating sudden imperial interventions. Trust eroded, replaced by cautious alliances and self-preservation strategies. The elite, once confident in their standing, learned humility as a survival skill. Citizens grew skilled in reading expressions, interpreting gestures, and managing impressions. Survival demanded intelligence, patience, and above all, caution. The empire, outwardly stable, masked an underlying fragility. Trade, governance, and cultural life continued, but all were guided by fear. Political and social institutions had adapted to Tiberius's methods, and the citizens' resilience was as much about learning to navigate terror as about genuine civic pride. By the end of this period, it was clear that the emperor's indirect rule had reshaped Rome at every level. Society, law, and family life had all been calibrated to anticipate, respond to, and survive the emperor's distant but omnipresent authority. The final years of Tiberius's life were marked by a mixture of fear, paranoia, and an almost obsessive preoccupation with legacy. Capri remained his sanctuary, yet even from this idyllic island, his presence weighed heavily over the empire. Couriers arrived daily, carrying reports of every minor event across Rome and the provinces. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. The villas, adorned with gardens, fountains, and terraces, were outwardly serene but internally buzzing with the tension of those who served the emperor. Every decision, every glance, and every gesture could be judged and punished. By this time, the emperor's physical form had further deteriorated. Historical accounts describe him as gaunt, his face lined with age and illness, his movements deliberate and careful. The once formidable general now appeared frail, yet his mental acuity remained sharp. He relied heavily on astrologers and trusted aides to interpret omens and predict threats. These predictions dictated his daily actions, when he would leave his quarters, whom he would meet, and which parts of the empire required attention. The ever-present fear of betrayal consumed his thoughts, and every interaction was filtered through a lens of suspicion. Rome itself had adapted to his remote rule. Senators continued to perform their duties, but their actions were now carefully choreographed. Public speeches were measured, subtle signals were constantly evaluated, and citizens practiced restraint in all interactions. Even casual gatherings became opportunities for observation, and any misstep, however minor, could have consequences for careers, property, or personal safety. Families negotiated alliances with extreme caution, often prioritizing survival over affection or ambition. The legal system had solidified into a mechanism of control. Trials continued to serve as warnings, and judges exercised great care in interpreting laws to demonstrate loyalty. Lawyers learned to temper their defenses and present arguments that would not provoke imperial suspicion. Over decades, these practices became ingrained in the fabric of Roman governance. Justice, once a principle, had been replaced by performance. Appearances mattered more than truth, and loyalty more than law. The military, too, felt the long shadow of Tiberius. Legions remained disciplined, but operational decisions were constrained by political considerations. Generals navigated a delicate balance between fulfilling military objectives and adhering to imperial oversight. Promotions and assignments were influenced as much by perceived loyalty as by merit. Across the empire, commanders learned that survival required subtlety, diplomacy, and careful attention to the emperor's distant scrutiny. Tiberius's engagement with the world outside Capri became increasingly selective. He occasionally ventured onto the mainland, not for pleasure, but to assert his authority. These journeys, though rare, inspired awe and fear, reinforcing his control through spectacle. Courtiers and provincial leaders were reminded that, despite the distance, his reach was comprehensive. Every action and word in Rome, and indeed across the empire, could be traced back to the will of the emperor. Amid these displays of control, the human consequences of his reign were profound. Families lived in constant anxiety, learning to navigate a world dominated by fear. Citizens adapted by refining gestures, expressions, and speech, transforming social interactions into subtle performances of loyalty. Cultural and civic life continued, yet always under the shadow of imperial scrutiny. Institutions, from legal courts to military commands, were shaped not by principle, but by the requirement to survive. As Tiberius neared the end of his life, his death became a matter of calculated timing. Even in his final days, he remained obsessed with omens and the prediction of threats. He consulted astrologers and read signs from nature, making adjustments to routines and interactions based on their counsel. His death, when it eventually came, was sudden and quietly administered, leaving behind an empire poised between relief and apprehension. The transition to his successor, Caligula, was marked by both hope and uncertainty. Rome had endured the reign of a ruler whose distant presence had reshaped its institutions, society, and culture in ways that would last for generations. The legacy of Tiberius was paradoxical. On the one hand, the empire remained intact, borders defended, and trade ongoing. On the other hand, the moral and social fabric of Rome had been profoundly altered. Fear and self-preservation had replaced civic virtue. Justice had become a performance, and survival was determined by one's ability to navigate a complex network of observation and suspicion. The islands of Capri, with their beauty and tranquility, had become symbols of the power of psychological control, illustrating how the distant influence of a ruler could shape an entire civilization.